Hello, dear viewers. I am a global nationalist. I support nationalism in my country, India, and in all countries around the globe. Today is the last Saturday of the month, and so, as per my schedule, I will be making a video about nationalism in a country outside of South Asia. Today, the country I want to focus on is Russia. Today, I want to talk about Russia's perspective in the Russia Ukraine conflict. The timeline is begins in February of that year. On the 22nd, the Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych was removed. This was in this was done in the revolution, the Ukrainian Revolution, which was sponsored by America's and NATO agencies such as the CIA, and to remove this president and to install a president who was friendly towards the West. Uh, then on the 23rd, pro Russian demonstrations occurred in Crimea, which were, which signaled to Russia that the Crimeans were willing to go over to Russia to join with Russia. On the 27th, masked Russian troops without Russian insignia took over Crimean parliament. It has since been learned by, I think, US agencies that even though these troops were not wearing an insignia, they were indeed Russian. That's why it says masked Russian troops. In On March 16th, there was a referendum held in Crimea. This referendum asked local populations whether they wanted to be a part of Russia as a federal subject or they wanted to restore Crimea's status as a part of Ukraine. Now, this particularly is referring to the 1992 constitution of Crimea, which gave Crimea a high degree of autonomy uh, with respect to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, but was still a part of Ukraine. This is different than what was Crimea's status at that point, where it was slowly losing its autonomy. So these are the two options presented to the people of Crimea. And the official results were that in Crimea, 97% of the vote was for integration of the region into the Russian Federation, with an 83% voter turnout. 18th, Russia incorporated Crimea as a part of the Russian Federation. In April, Russian citizens in the uh, took control of the Donbas separatist movement, which until then was being led and uh, controlled by the people of Donbas, who are uh, live in us and sorry the Donbas is a northeastern part of Ukraine, which is like Crimea, majorly Russian speaking. And these people were protesting against the central government of Ukraine, saying that they were feeling that they were being oppressed by Kiev. And later, as the protests went on, Russian citizens from Russia came and took control of the movement. In August, Ukraine anti terrorist forces attacked Donbass and Russia invaded the Donbass. And in September the 5th, the Minsk Protocol was signed and drew a line between Ukraine and separatist controlled regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. I'll explain this later. In November, the Ukrainian military reported intense movement of troops and equipment from Russia into the separatist controlled parts of eastern Ukraine. So Russia was still trying to support the separatists in eastern Ukraine. 2016. In August of that year, on the 8th, Ukraine reported that Russia had increased its military presence and border crossings were closed. On the 10th, the Russian security agency, the FSB, claimed it had prevented Ukrainian terrorist attacks and that two of its servicemen were killed in clashes. Ukraine denied this. Other than that, nothing much happened until 2018, when in November 25th, three Ukrainian boats traveling from Odessa to Mariupol attempted to cross the Kerch Strait, which came under control of Russia in 2014. So these three boats were captured by Russian warships who fired on them, and 24 Ukrainian soldiers were detained, sailors, sorry, were detained. Lawmaker in the next day, in the 26th, lawmakers in the Ukrainian parliament supported imposition of martial law along Ukraine's coastal regions and those bordering Russia. 2021, this while it's interesting that from the Western media and the global media as a whole, we've been hearing that the current round of tensions between Ukraine and Russia were started by military buildups in Russia. However, this is not true because in March, there was a massive NATO military exercise called Defender Europe 21, which was one of the largest NATO led military exercises in Europe in decades. Which this exercise was done to uh, supposedly defend all of Europe against Russian invasion. This alarmed Russia. They believe that this was somehow a precursor to an invasion by NATO countries. And in April, the Russian military moved large quantities of arms and equipment from western and central Russia and as far away as Siberia into occupied Crimea. And on the 17th, yeah, the FSB detained the Ukrainian consul general in St. Petersburg over spying allegations. Now, as far as I know, I have not been able to find any information about what happened to this case. I don't know if this person was proven to be a spy, so I can't comment on that. Now, the latest is in November of this year, on the 13th, when the Ukrainian president, the new President Zelensky, who was re elected after Poroshenko's term came to an end, the Ukrainian president announced that Russia has again amassed 1 lakh troops in the border area. So, where we are now is that it is true that Russia has amassed 100,000 troops in the border area. However, these troops have not crossed into Ukraine, not even into Crimea. They are still in Russia's borders. And it must be noted that NATO is flying fighter jets and even bombers a few kilometers away from the Ukraine Russia border, which President Putin mentioned in a speech a few days ago. So both sides are finding it difficult to come to some resolution of this conflict. Now, I'll talk about some of the diplomatic efforts taken by both sides to resolve this. These are mainly in the Minsk agreements, also called as the Minsk Protocols. The first Minsk Protocol was signed on 5th September 2014. The following representatives signed the document: the Swiss diplomat and OSCE representative, the former president of Ukraine and Ukrainian representative Leonid Kuchma, Russian ambassador to Ukraine, and the rebel heads Alexander Zakharenko and Igor Plotnitsky. These are the people who are the heads of the Donetsk and Donbass regions who were at that time. So you can see that Russia had sent its actual ambassador, but Ukraine had sent its former president. And This shows that I think Ukraine was not as committed to fulfilling this protocol as Russia was. Russia seemed to have given it higher importance by sending in someone actively serving in the government. And so this protocol basically did the usual. It ensured an immediate bilateral ceasefire, monitoring verification of the ceasefire by the OSCE, decentralizing of power, um, to ensure the monitoring of the Ukrainian border by the OSCE, and which is a council responsible for security in Europe, and the immediate release of all hostages, a law preventing prosecution, punishment of persons in connection with events that have taken place in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, uh, was that there must continue to be an inclusive national dialogue in Ukraine, to take measures to improve the humanitarian situation in Donbass, to ensure early local elections in accordance with Ukrainian law, to withdraw illegal armed groups and military equipment as well as fighters and mercenaries from the territory of Ukraine, to adopt a program of economic recovery and reconstruction, and to provide personal security. So, in this, I pretty much agree with all of this. Yeah, like there's nothing in here that I disagree with. And I think the most important uh, provision in this agreement is this number four, to ensure the permanent monitoring of the border by the OSCE, with the creation of security zones in the border regions. And we can see that before I go on, this reason why this is so important is that if implemented, then both sides will be monitored by a third party, which would make sure that they wouldn't cross their borders. Now, there was a follow up memorandum signed after this agreement to ban flights by combat aircraft, to withdraw all foreign mercenaries, to ban offensive operations, to pull heavy weaponry, and to task the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine with monitoring implementation of the Minsk Protocol. Unfortunately, by January 2015, this entire protocol ceasefire had completely collapsed anymore. So yeah, this first Minsk agreement failed completely. Now, Minsk 2 was also formed. This was developed at a summit in Minsk on 11th February 2015 by leaders of Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany. The talks that led to the deal were overseen by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Immediate and full ceasefire in particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine and its strict fulfillment. Pull out of all heavy weapons, effective monitoring and verification of ceasefire regime, and pull out of heavy weapons. On the first day of the pullout, a dialogue is to start, yada yada. Provide pardon and amnesty by way of enacting a law that forbids persecution and punishment of persons in relation to events that took place in Donetsk and Luhansk. Provide release and exchange of all hostages. Provide safe access, delivery, storage. Restore social economic connections, including social transfers. Restore control of the state border to Ukrainian government in the whole conflict zone, which has to start on the first day after the local election. Pull out of all armed formations, constitutional reform in Ukraine, which includes decentralization in the Donetsk and Donbass and Luhansk. And yeah, I agree with this protocol, this second protocol in all forms, except um, this particular provision, which says that to restore control of the state border to the Ukrainian government in the whole conflict zone. This I don't think was necessary. I think the Donetsk and Donbass and Luhansk oblasts should have been allowed to maintain control of their state borders, at least their state borders, because the Ukrainian government had already agreed to giving them more autonomy and self governance. This gives, I guess, this gives mixed signals to the people of the oblasts, and so this protocol didn't survive. The fighting generally subsided after the ceasefire came into effect, but uh, skirmishes and shelling continued in several parts of the zone. So um, I think that the, uh, the Minsk agreements are still the best diplomatic choice to resolve this conflict. And if you can notice, nowhere in here, in either of the Minsk 1 or Minsk 2 protocols, does it mention Crimea becoming back to Ukraine. I think that means that Ukraine has de facto, if not de jure, accepted Crimea as part of Russia now. Now I want to show you something, an article written by President Vladimir Putin himself. This is titled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. In this article, he explains how he feels about Ukrainians and the Ukraine country, and why he is taking the actions he is taking. Um, he starts off by talking about, and he was asked about Russian Ukrainian relations, and he said that the Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. Uh, he has, as he says here, he has said this on numerous occasions, and it's something that he firmly believes. I know this to be true because he has said this earlier, not just after this conflict. Now, he says that the wall that has emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine is, to his mind, our. He uses the word our to refer to both Russians and Ukrainians as a single people, a great common misfortune and tragedy. And he admits that these are mistakes by their own people, but also because of forces that wanted to undermine their unity. He's referring to earlier the Poland and European countries, and now I guess he's talking about the US and NATO. He goes on to talk about Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus, which was the largest state in Europe. Ancient Rus was not necessarily a country, but was a kingdom or an empire, or basically a region, which was made up of the people who spoke at that time Old Russian. This spread from where Moscow and St. Petersburg and all the way to where Kiev and even some countries in further from into Europe, and including Belarus. So this whole region is where modern Russia began, and then it expanded eastward and southward. So he is so from the beginning, as he says, Ukraine has been a part of Russia, and although it was that they were bound together by one language called Old Russian, economic ties, the rule of the princes, and the Orthodox faith. The spiritual choice made by Saint Vladimir, who was both Prince of Novgorod and Grand Prince of Kiev, still largely determines our affinity today. The throne of Kiev held the dominant position in ancient Rus. This has been the custom since the late 9th century. This line is very important. It shows that he does respect Ukraine. He views it as a valuable part of Russian history and Russia's legacy. And he's showing that it has always been an important part of the Russian Empire. And that, and according to him, this strengthens the reasoning for Ukraine to be part of Russia today. And he talks about how, up to the middle of the 15th century, the unified church government remained in place. At a new stage, disturbing you and getting in the way, I deeply apologize. So, until the 15th century, a unified church government remained in place. This was the Orthodox Church. Then there were two Russias created, two different Ruses, one Lithuanian, one Moscowan. Uh, Now, these could have become the points of attraction and consolidation of the territories of ancient Rus. However, Moscow became the center of unification, and they cast off the foreign yoke. The foreign yoke he's referring to are the uh, Mongols, Batu Khan, the Golden Horde that had invaded ancient Rus and destroyed and conquered Kiev. And he talks about how um, both these regions became further apart from each other, and that uh, Lithuania in the 14th century converted to Catholicism and signed the Union of Lublin with the Kingdom of Poland to form the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. As a consequence, in the 16th to 17th centuries, the liberation movement of the Orthodox population was gaining strength. This was because um, Orthodoxy was ousted from the Poland and Lithuanian Commonwealth, and this is interesting because even now, Russia seems to be in conflict with Poland, which is right now occurring, uh, not directly, but through Belarus, the migrant crisis between Belarus and Poland. And yeah, so this continues. He goes on to talk about how mainly it's been Poland that has been pulling the the western parts of the Russian Empire away from the main part of Russia. And he talks about in this paragraph that the name Ukraine was used more often in the meaning of the old Russian word Ukraina, which is found in written sources from the 12th century referring to various border territories. And the word Ukrainian, judging by archival documents, originally referred to frontier guards who protected the external borders. So this shows that Ukraine has always been considered as a part of Russia. It was never thought of as a separate country. Now, uh, he does talk about how, since Russia was such a large empire, many centuries of fragmentation and living within different states naturally brought about regional language peculiarities, resulting in the emergence of dialects. Here he says that the vernacular enriched the literary language. He says that there are three authors or poets, I'm not sure who these people are. Their works are the common literary and cultural heritage of both Ukraine and Russia. Taras Shvenko wrote poetry in the Ukrainian language and prose mainly in Russian. And so he talks about this, goes on talking about how um, Russia and Ukraine have had a strong relationship and they're pretty much the same people, that they shouldn't be considered separate. Um, Here he talks about how uh, he doesn't want to idealize the past because he does know that there were some things done by Russia that to Ukraine which were wrong. For example, the Valuev Circular of 1863 and the Ems Ukaz of 1876, which restricted publication and importation of religious and socio-political literature in the Ukrainian language. This, however, he says, is just a political move, and this wasn't done because out of anger towards Ukraine, but because of Poland exploiting the Ukrainian issue to their advantage. He says that works of fiction, books of Ukrainian poetry, and folk songs continue to be published. So only the socio-political literature could not be imported. This shows that Ukrainian language, at least, was still considered welcome by the rest of the Russians. And he talks about how about the February Revolution, which is the Russian Revolution. I didn't know it's called that. Uh, yeah, he talks about how the Bolsheviks basically created the country of Ukraine almost out of whole cloth, and just 1 minute. Here is an important paragraph. The Bolsheviks treated the Russian people as inexhaustible material for their social experiments. They dreamt of a world revolution that would wipe out national states. This is crucial to understand what communism is. Communism is not limited to one nation but to all. It wants to create a global dictatorship of the proletariat. And this is why it's so dangerous. It's a threat to every nation, not just Russia. And he explains how the Bolsheviks were basically dividing Russia into different uh, states and countries, and this is how Ukraine was created. I think this is important because it shows that he doesn't support the Bolsheviks, that he himself is not a communist. He believes that, as he says here, Russia was robbed indeed by the Bolsheviks. He completely, if not hates them, at least despises them. Now, he says that the leaders of modern Ukraine and their external patrons prefer to overlook these facts that he's mentioned in this article. They talk about the crimes of the Soviet regime, but they ignore that uh, the events that they refer to do not uh, have anything to do with the USSR or even modern Russia. They also forget to ignore that the Bolsheviks also committed vast wrongs and crimes against the Russian people as well. He says to this article now you can see is clearly addressed to the people of Ukraine and the government. He says if you want to establish a state of your own, you are welcome, but what are the terms? He will says he um, recalls an assessment given by one of the most prominent political figures of New Russia, the first mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak. He was a legal expert, and in 1992, he shared the following opinion: the republics that were founders of the Union, having denounced the 1922 Union Treaty, which created the USSR, the Soviet Union, must return to the boundaries they had before joining the Soviet Union. I agree with this. Basically, countries that were part of the Union territory, part of the Soviet Union, if they're leaving the Union territory, the the Soviet Union, then all the territory that they got after joining must be handed back, and their territorial boundaries must be the same as what they were before the USSR came into existence. This is, I think, completely valid. All other territorial acquisitions are subject to discussion and negotiations given that the ground has been revoked. In other words, when you leave, take what you brought with you. This logic is hard to refute. I agree. And he says that the Russian Federation recognized the new geopolitical realities and not only recognized but indeed did a lot for Ukraine to establish itself. He says that from 1991 to 2013, Ukraine's budget savings amounted to more than $82 billion, which was due to support from Russia. And today it holds a mere 1.5 billion US dollars of Russian payments for gas transit to Europe. If economic ties between the countries had been retained, Ukraine would enjoy the benefits of tens of billions of dollars. So he argues that Ukraine's actions against Russia have harmed Ukraine mainly. So, yeah, he basically doesn't view Ukraine as a completely separate, different country from Russia. He seems to view it as almost uh, another state, another province of Russia. Now, he talks about how right now there's a forced change of identity where the most despicable thing is that the Russians in Ukraine are being forced not only to deny their roots, generations of their ancestors, but also to believe that Russia is their enemy. This is wrong. I also agree that this is similar to what happens in Pakistan against India, where are being brainwashed to hate India, even though their ancestors, their roots, their cultural identity and traditions are Indian, and the whole country is based on being anti-Indian. I fear that whoever is in spouting this propaganda in Ukraine, specifically the West, the US and EU, they're going to make Ukraine into the Pakistan for Russia, which would cause great harm. And in fact, President Putin has accused the Ukrainian government of supporting terrorism, which is another potential similarity between Ukraine and Pakistan. Of course, I'm not saying Ukraine is like Pakistan now. It isn't. I'm just saying that continuing on this path, it might become. So, what are the options that Russia has? I think Russia should uh, keep Crimea. That should be non-negotiable. Mainly because um, the Crimean people were always in favor of joining Russia. This can be seen here, where in these polls, the United Nations Development Program conducted a series of polls in Crimea between '09 and 2011 about the question of leaving Ukraine and joining Russia with a sample size of 1,200. Yes, no, undecided 70% yes, no 14%. And as it went on, it went maximum down to 65.6%. But the people saying no remained the same. The undecided increased, but increased and then decreased. So this shows that the people of Crimea have always wanted to be a part of Russia. They don't consider themselves as separate from Russia. This isn't just referring to the ethnic Russians, but also 55% of ethnic Ukrainians and 14% of ethnic Crimean Tatars, respectively. So I do think that they should just keep Crimea with them. As far as the other regions, the Donetsk and uh, Lusav regions, I think that they should also have another referendum in those regions, this time monitored by the United Nations. Uh, and they should ask the people of those regions whether they want to be a part of Russia, Ukraine, or their own individual countries. And I think that both countries, both Russia and Ukraine, will have to agree to that. I think um, both Minsk agreements should be re-implemented, even though they haven't been followed and they've been broken. I think that they're still useful. Some changes need to be made. I think that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe should not be a signatory to this party because it's monitoring the border, and because it's a European agency, it is possibly biased towards the EU, which favors Ukraine. And so I think it would be better if a neutral party was monitoring the border. I think that could be the United Nations or some other group, I'm not sure. But other than that, I don't see a big problem in these agreements, and I think that they can be re implemented. I don't think they're completely useless now. However, what President Putin says here is alarming. He says the inhabitants of these regions will never accept the order that they have tried, that he's trying to Kiev as by day, that they have tried and are trying to impose by force, blockade, and threats. And he says that the outcome of both Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, which give a real chance to peacefully restore the territorial integrity of Ukraine by coming to an agreement directly with the DPR and LPR with Russia, Germany, and France as mediators, contradicts the entire logic of the anti Russia project. True. If Ukraine was so anti Russia, then why are they trying to mediate and come to terms with DPR and LPR? They're recognizing that these regions are pro Russia, that they're not separate from Russia, that all of Ukraine is not a separate country from Russia, that there are lots of bonds. Um, and he says this is what is actually happening. We are facing the creation of a climate of fear in Ukrainian society, aggressive rhetoric, neo Nazis, militarizing the country. He, I'm sorry, I need to find. He says that there are millions of people in Ukraine who are not anti Russia, but they are not allowed to raise their heads. They have had the legal opportunity to defend their point of view taken away from them. They are intimidated, driven underground, and he talks about how neo Nazis in Ukraine have attacked the ethnic Russians of Ukraine. And so I do fear that if Ukraine does win this conflict, then there could be mass persecution, if not genocide, of the ethnic Russians in these regions. So, yeah, these are what I think the options are for Russia. One, to simply implement the Minsk agreements and follow them to the bone, and to simply to and two, accept Crimea as part of your own, but to leave the Donetsk and Luhansk regions with Ukraine, but with more independence and autonomy. Three, take the Donetsk and Luhansk regions as well, and simply leave Ukraine with just West Ukraine, which is mainly made up of the Ukrainian speaking population. And this would, I think, have to be done not through the Minsk Agreement, obviously, but through a separate protocol. And Four would be to do the same to divide Ukraine into from its eastern half, but this would have to be done through war. This is the last option I think Russia has. I don't see any other fourth choice, any other choice that they can have other than these ones, these four, following the Minsk agreement, keeping Crimea, giving up Donetsk and Luhansk, keeping Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk through diplomacy, and keeping them and taking them through force. I do hope that this issue is resolved peacefully, but I do think Russia has a greater, if not, I'm not sure what the claim to Ukraine. They are right that Ukraine should be, if not merged with Russia, at least friendly and should not be a pawn against Russia being used by the Western powers. And he says something very nice that Russia has never been and never will be anti Ukraine. And what Ukraine will be, it is up to its citizens to decide. So he is not going to force anything on the Ukrainian citizens. I suppose he means the Ukrainian speaking citizens. That is still there, just their decision to make. So, yes, this is what I want to talk about. If you want to watch, just wait. Yes, if you want to watch another video in this playlist, click here. If you want to watch my previous video, click here. Thank you for watching. Vande Mataram.